This week's topic was prompted by something that I've been seeing in quite a few lessons for the correspondence courses I teach. And I've seen it in the finishing class and in the basics class. In the basics class, lesson 3 is about measuring gauge. And in the master's program, we measure gauge in a very specific way that gives you a much more accurate reading than just laying a ruler down and counting stitches. And that is, you mark an area that you're going to measure for gauge. And it can be 5 inches, 4 inches. You can even sometimes get an accurate gauge with 3 inches. And then you count the stitches in that space. And then you divide the number of stitches by the width if you convert the width to a decimal point. And this gives you an extremely accurate count that is the number of stitches. And if you want to find out more about this method, you can look at my blog entries on calculating gauge, because it's very specific and it's a method that a lot of designers use because it gives you much more accurate numbers. But in any case, in those instructions, I tell the students to place marking thread between columns of stitches, not in a column of stitches. And I do this for a specific reason. Of course, you can calculate the gauge with half stitches, but I want to see if they understand stitch anatomy, because stitch anatomy is very, very important for several reasons. One, you're never going to be able to finish properly if you don't understand stitch anatomy. It's just a rule. Finishing should be done in very specific places, seams and pickup stitches, and if you don't understand what those are, your finishing is going to look amateurish. The next reason is you're not going to be able to fix mistakes if you cannot tell what a stitch is. Now, in stockinette, knit stitches are frequently described as looking like a V. And by that, we mean it's pinched at the bottom like a V, and it's more open at the top. That is what a stitch looks like. This is what a column of stitches look like. It's a bunch of V's interlocked. The space between stitches look like an upside down V. It's pinched at the top, it's open at the bottom. So this is the space between. This is the column of stitches. Now, complicating that fact is that when you turn a piece of knitting upside down, it looks like stitches. These look like they're stitches, columns of stitches. But the way that I can tell that I have this upside down is I have this column of stitches and I have only half of a selvage stitch on the side. So if I were to place my seam there or pick up stitches there, it would not be as strong. Now, of course, if you're knitting something top down, that is the way it's going to be. But if you're knitting from top up, often I find that my students cannot read their work, and by that I mean tell the difference from the bind off and the cast on edge. And these are things that you need to do in order to finish, in order to fix your work, and so on. Now, I have done tons and tons of videos and blog entries on reading your work and stitch anatomy. So I would suggest for more specific details that you go there. Now, let's look at garter stitch for a minute, and I'm going to orient this properly. That, kind of hard to tell. That is a cast on edge. Here is my bind off edge. It looks like a little crochet chain at the top. Now, when I'm looking at garter or reverse stockinette, the stitch is the thing that looks like a frown. Notice that I've got smiles and frowns interlocking. And when I see a frown, I know that that is the stitch. The smile is the space between the stitches. So if I'm going to mark where to measure for my garter stitch gauge, I'm going to place it in the smiles. Otherwise, I'm going to have to remember that I've got it in the center of the stitch and calculate half stitches for the gauge. Now, the other thing that I've noticed that people have problems with when they are marking for gauge is, again, that was upside down. There's my cast on edge, my bind off edge, there's my cast on edge, is where to mark for rows. And if I were to read the pattern for this, The instructions say work an inch or a half inch or whatever in stockinette, and then on row 1, make a decrease. And many, many, many knitters will think that this is the decrease row, where one stitch is on top of the other. That's not the decrease row. That is the row before the decrease. The actual decrease row is where I knit those two guys together. So if I were placing a marker before row 1 of my pattern, it's not down here before those two stitches. It is in that first decrease row. The same is true at the top. The last row of the pattern is on the wrong side, and it is where you work a wrong side row. So when people will mark where the pattern ends, they will frequently mark right here. That's the last pattern row. No, that's row 3 in this case. That is row 4, and this is the row after. So you need to be able to read your work to tell where something begins and ends. And if you're having troubles with this, because it is difficult, you can always, when you're working row 1 of a pattern, put in a little safety pin on that row that will help you count it, or you can place a lifeline on it as well if you have trouble reading it. Now, why is this important? I've got a couple, whoops, sorry, not trying to make you dizzy. I've got a couple of examples here, and these are from finishing. Okay. Notice in this swatch I have made a seam. These are two separate pieces, and I have my columns of knit stitches, and they absolutely look identical going up there. And you would not be able to tell that there is a seam there if I didn't have these strings hanging off it. That is what a seam is supposed to look like. If I can't tell the difference between where one stitch begins and another stitch ends, I could have a seam that looks like this. Now notice on this side I have half a stitch, and one half of the stitch is blue, one half of the stitch is white. Now that's because I place the seam in the selvage stitch. I work up here, and all of a sudden I realize on this side, oh, I've got it in the wrong place. Now that stitch is sloppy and not so nice looking, and it certainly is visible. So that's why I need to know what the difference is between a column of stitches and a knot, the space between a column of stitches, because you can wind up like this, and I've seen this a bit frequently, and it's makes something look homemade, not handmade. Now, the same is true is if you cannot identify what an actual stitch is. When you do a horizontal seam, you insert your needle into the center of a stitch and bring it out of the center of the next stitch. And if you don't know what a center of a stitch looks like, you can wind up with something like this. This is a seam where it has been placed in between the columns of stitches. And notice that instead of having the stitches neatly continuing on to the other piece, I've got what I think it's Nikki Epstein calls the dread 11s. It's pinched the column of stitches together. And I guess you could say it's decorative, but it certainly disrupts the line of the seams, where if you look at this piece, the column of stitches continue. Now, admittedly, they're a little pinched at the stitch line, but this is the shoulder, so it won't matter. Now, again, I'm not going to go ahead and do hundreds of examples of stitch anatomy because I've already done lots of videos on this. And in my blog, I will put in links to those specific videos and blog entries that I've done before, so that if you're having difficulty with this, either in finishing or in marking swatches for gauge, you can look at those.